We're back again. This is Sarah Milligan with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. Today's date is March 26, 2015, and I'm here again with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz for part 2 of a series of interviews about her research, her life, and her relationship to Oklahoma. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time doing a sort of a rough overview of where you have traveled, where you've been, what you've participated in over your career, and a little bit of your personal life, and made reference to sort of the where you can get more story from the memoirs that you've written, as well as some points in research. This interview can also be complemented by the book talk that you gave last night on March 25th for the library, because I know we'll have that recording as well, so that helps sort of bring a little bit of a tag towards your research angle of things. And I actually thought that we might follow up a little bit with that today. Start with a little bit of your research, and then get back into some other things. I know I've still got to ask you about Stillwater, and we may talk about some other things towards the end. So I wanted to start today by following up from something that you said at the end of our interview yesterday. And it was sort of this reference that you saw your place in the sort of activist movement, especially maybe with the Native Indigenous discussion, as the historian, as the person who can help chronicle and who can help write about and who can help sort of bring attention to the needs of this movement through the long history and the long picture. Maybe you can talk a little bit about if that's an accurate summary of what you were saying yesterday, as well as sort of maybe the ways that you've been able to do that.
Yes, I think we we all need to find our, at least the Native way is, who are you responsible to? And if you don't have a cohesive tribal identity and citizenship where you take those responsibilities or find a way to be of service, then on the outside you have to sort of identify or help get other people to help identify what your responsibility would be. So this comes not just from my decision, but also what has been asked of me, and that consistently has always been research projects, some, and teaching, oral history, the UN work. So those have been my emphasis, and I'm still an activist in the sense that I still work with many different organized groups. We have I co-founded an organization called the Indigenous World Association that does the work at the UN, and I'm sort of retired from it. We founded it in 1981 and got the UN status, non-governmental status, in 1985. I was very, very active in that with my co-founder, who's a Lakota from Pine Ridge, Chalky Cotier. And now it's, there's a Mohawk from Kanawaki in Canada who's the head of it, and Hawaiian Native lawyer, Acoma activists, and then a couple of Latin American Native people from Latin America, Amazonia and Mapuche. So that, that work goes on, and I attend sometimes. Like, we had a very big conference last September that was a World Conference on Indigenous Peoples at the General Assembly of the United Nations. It was the highest level meeting we've ever had. So I went. I didn't work on the preparation and all as the others did, but I went just because I wanted to mark the occasion and be there. But I keep up with it and do what I can to, bring in lecture fees and other things to help support the work of the organization. So, and then I'm active locally in the Bay Area with everything from the prison industrial complex, working with those groups some, and in the, of course, in the Native community, now we have this big issue of the canonization of Father Junipero Serra, the Franciscan priest who was in charge of developing the colonial system in California, the mission system. And this Pope Francis just announced a couple of months ago that was going to be canonized. He was beatified back in the 70s, and the lobby from Native people, in this whole period has kind of, it seemed like, they just decided to leave it on the shelf. And suddenly this new progressive pope is doing all these interesting things that we all are, want to like him. And then he comes up with this, and it was just really threw everyone for a loop, because we thought we had kind of frozen that forever, He remains beatified, but not a saint. And so that's, I've gotten very involved in that. The redskin, the use of native names and symbols and slurs like redskins. So we have a lot of activities demonstrating at ball games and everything. So, and this period of renewed warfare, a lot of anti-war, anti-intervention work. I did a lot of that, in the 80s in Central America. So all of these, it's not just that I mainly focus on the Native movement for the international work and the research. But then I also wrote my, the 3 memoirs that, and I write on other issues as well, labor issues and Oklahoma, Since my red dirt growing up Okie, Oklahoma's not my academic specialization, but it's my life story, and become more and more interested in, and there's several people doing research here that I keep up with, and communicate with, and some have become very close friends, and mentioned Rachel Jackson in particular, who's getting her doctorate in English at University of Oklahoma, who started she and her husband, who is a union activist, started Labor Fest in Oklahoma City a few years ago. So they're also activists, and she's an academic. And I'm just so impressed with young people here, and then the young Native people here who got mobilized against the centennial being celebrated in 2007. That was, I was pretty active in that. So I try to get back to Oklahoma whenever I can. It's where I really most like to, get involved in things.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Maybe just getting back to the centennial, what was your role in what was going on and what was happening? What were some of the...
Brenda Golden, who's an amazing Native activist here in Oklahoma, she was sort of the person, I think, that was the mainstay of the organized protests. Aaron McCarley, who's an Oklahoma native but not a Native American, filmmaker, documentarian, started filming, all of the processes, and so I became one of the interview subjects, and that film is still, she's still working on it. It's going to be an important feature film, I think. So I think, anywhere I can lend my, you never know in Oklahoma, sometimes lending your name as an outsider, even though I'm from Oklahoma, can be detrimental to something. In other cases, it might be useful. So I kind of have to gauge that, because I know the culture here. Oh, that San Francisco person coming in, and but I think that has changed a lot. Even in the last 20 years or so, that since the society here has become much more diverse and multicultural, and there are a lot of problems, with bias and prejudice, but there's also just a lot of, especially, just among common people, intermarriage, and, very, very different. I went to a big family reunion of a friend about 5 years ago. I mean, they have really a big family. I mean, there were like maybe 500 people there, and in a church basement. And there were intermarriage and children of Vietnamese, Mexican, Central American, African American. This is a white family, and a very working class white family, and also they're Seventh-day Adventists. And I was just, it was just such a pleasure, to see that in Oklahoma, and everyone just getting along, and celebrating together. And the elderly, the matriarch, about 95 years old, being kind of the center of, it was kind of going to be her last, probably, she wasn't going to be around much longer. And this is really, it's so enriching, and so healthy, that if this is going on, and I've seen this must be, not some exceptional thing. This is going on in Oklahoma now.
I think that's an interesting perspective, especially in conjunction with the national perspective of Oklahoma. I mean, what makes the national news and what leads
Right.
is, the fraternity getting expelled at OU recently,
yeah.
right? So
Big
for
news.
very obvious sort of lingering racism and a lot of the things that are go through the legislation, all of the anti-LGBT legislation that's being proposed this year. I think there were 17 pieces of legislation that were on the books at the beginning of the season this year, and those all in the canceling AP history. Those are just this year. So it's how do you reconcile that, since you are tied to Oklahoma, right? And people know you're tied to Oklahoma, but yet you live in the greater world, meaning not just in California, but you
Right.
travel, and you are sort of this figurehead for a lot of things. Does that that chance to talk about sort of the greater levels of that ever become, I don't know, does that something you feel like that you need to advocate or share with people?
Well, I usually am, I try not to be ever dogmatic and rude like I used to be when I would come visit.
When did that change?
And start yelling at people. Mainly my family members, and stomping out. Never going to come back here. I think since I did Red Dirt and can re-enter with with everything in that book that I assumed would probably be offensive to like maybe even 90% of the population if they read it, didn't turn out that way. And that it got adopted and embraced, so I feel much more comfortable expressing, calmly my ideas or challenging others without getting angry and defensive and accusatory and just understanding better, because I think it's an amazing thing about the writing process is that it's also a way of learning, almost learning from yourself, or teaching yourself a deeper way of thinking about things. So as I wrote about my own family, how I came to have compassion for certain things I had had a lot of resentment for before. So I think that kind of attitude sort of comes through, you know, the vibes people are getting from you. And so I always feel very comfortable here now. And even, you know, in all kinds of different situations, I feel like one really important, valuable characteristic of most Oklahomans is they really like a straight shooter, you know, someone who says exactly what they think, even if they disagree with it, that you're not being wily or dishonest or, you know, withholding information or trying to be something you're not, you know, authenticity. So I think that just comes really easy now that I can be myself. But I'm also very changed self since I spent the 90s kind of reviewing all of that. And really falling in love with Oklahoma again because, you know, I had all kinds of nostalgia that would happen when I'm elsewhere, and I would just, you know, put it out of my mind. The one I like to tell most is how every time I go on the freeway that goes to Sacramento from San Francisco, you go through an area where the Standard Oil refineries are. And that smell in the air is nostalgic. It's like, yeah, that's how I thought air smelled when I grew up because we lived near the Deer Creek, Ohio refinery.
That burnt oil smell in the morning.
That oil smell in the morning. So that, but I would just, you know, bury those things. Don't think about that, you know, just interrupt any kind of nostalgia. And I see the countryside. I know when I was growing up, I was very attached to it. I was out, you know, in that red dirt and that red shale, creek beds, and, you know, I felt very close to this, or very tied to it. Mm-hmm. And so being able to feel that again and not feel like then, you know, I can't love it because, you know, it's hostile territory, is really nice. I am really, really grateful I did that for myself, you know.
Yeah. I think that's memoirs can be an interesting process, I guess, for ourselves, but for others. And I was thinking about this too in the relationship to your more strictly academic history pieces, right? Like the book that you just published, The Indigenous People's History of the United States. How do you reconcile sort of the books that you have that are more memoir based and the books that are strict history? Is it a different writing process for you? How do you sort of decide what's going to work best, and are there different audiences for the two?
That's a really important question. Around 1984, I wrote, one after another, I was publishing books and articles, and I wrote the Indians of the Americas, Self-Determination, Human Rights, which covered, you know, set up the sort of how it's a colonial system. Some of the things I do in this new book, the colonial system, settler colonialism, and then to look at, you know, mainly about the international work and why that's meaningful. And at that time when I was writing that book is when the Contra War was being fomented against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua by the Reagan administration. And so I had lots of Nicaraguan friends, and there are a lot of Nicaraguan, you know, migrants who came to San Francisco. They used to call it the second city of Nicaragua because so some of the people who were now in office were people I knew from going to San Francisco State with them, or the local poet, you know, Ernesto Cardenal, and the foreign minister had been born in Hollywood, California. So I knew these people personally, and so I took it very personally. And as I got involved, it was the first time that I was really in a war zone that the United States had created. Of course, it's not the first war zone in the United States, but it's the first time I've been there in the middle of it, looking out and seeing it through the eyes. My rhetoric of anti-imperialism or anti-militarism was based on morality, ethics, law, international law. Here it became, I was feeling that when those spy planes would buzz over. I mean, now they're drones, but there were, I can't remember, they were called blackbirds or something then. The black airplanes that people got paranoid about, they were up there. And they bragged, the Reagan administration, that they could see every toilet flushed in Nicaragua, which was a joke down there because there's so little running water. That's not a big feat. There aren't that many toilets. Right. Flush toilets in Nicaragua. But anyway, you get the point, that they could see anything. And you just know you're overhead, and then there are these warships just off the coast, that ready to invade. And then there are these Contras they've given landmines to, and you have to walk through fields of landmines, and people get blown up. They still are. They're, even in Vietnam, they still have landmines going off. And so you see your friends killed, or their legs blown off. And I myself would be in jeeps traveling, and there'd be someone walking in front with a detector, a mine detector. So you had to go very slowly, and just be very careful everywhere you walked. So living in that kind of danger, and I lived it only when I visited there. It's not like I was a full-time resident out in the eastern zone, the war zone. I became, I really thought everything I'm doing, all this research and publication, books that other academics read or other scholars, and, of course, Native people is very important. They have, access to this material. But I said, I've got to find a way to write the history of the United States that explains, because people, I come back and I would talk to audiences, and it's almost like they could hardly believe what I was saying, not to speak of the fact they didn't know where Nicaragua was, So this was speaking at UC Berkeley. I'm not talking about speaking in Oklahoma, at a Chamber of Commerce meeting or something. Right. It's like, where do we start even? And it's so vast. And it was actually, I started trying to write a book. I actually called it Onward Christian Soldiers, a History of the Military in the United States. And I was trying to write it in a different way than the usual history, so it would be very readable. And I found that I couldn't put these, I could write a story and sometimes a poem or something, but to put heavy-duty material into a readable, form that I want to be read beyond, beyond the academia or as a text in schools. So I started that in '86, and I fiddled with it, worked with it, and I got about 100 pages. Actually, I found, that became kind of the core of the book. I could say I worked on this book for 20 years.
It sounds a lot like you did. Yeah.
But I put it away. It actually became my daughter loved it, and she showed it to some of her friends. I made a copy for her, and she was in school at Berkeley, and she said everyone wants to read this, so they would make copies of it. So it got this circulation. It was kind of this little cult classic among young students and young people, young punks. This was the punk rock era, so it was really kind of interesting, this little movement around it. So I knew I had it, but I knew it wasn't yet how it needed to be. Plus, I myself really didn't, I would have to dedicate myself somehow. But what it led me to was to try to find a different way of writing. So in '89, I decided to go to a writing workshop in Bennington, and I stayed a month there. And it was just for, a lot of people were in different stages. Some people were in the middle of a book and just wanted a retreat, and also, it was a very pretty place, and it was fairly inexpensive.
Mm-hmm.
And some people just beginning, younger people just beginning, wanted to be writers and just beginning. So there was division: poetry, nonfiction, fiction. So I was in the nonfiction. And I was very lucky to have 2 weeks, one workshop leader, and 2 weeks another one. Both of them, white men, but they were both really good. They're both writing teachers, in academia, and just really good at encouraging you and, all the things you have to do. So I literally had to kind of rewire my brain with language, So I knew that wasn't enough. So one of the workshop leaders had a friend who taught creative writing at San Francisco State. So when I got back from that summer workshop, I made an appointment to see her and ask her if I could be in her workshop at San Francisco State. I told, and I had this letter from the friend, and she said, it's too primary, elementary for, where you are and what you're doing, because I gave her a sample of my writing. She said, but outside I have a writing workshop. It's just $20 a week. It meets once a week for 6 hours. It's just $20 each. And so I went to that writing workshop, and I almost just looked in and left, because who was sitting there but Amy Tan, whose book was the bestseller right at that time. And I thought, oh no, this is much too advanced for me.
Wow.
I won't even be able to show my work, to someone who's had advanced as a creative writer. But she had workshopped her book through that whole workshop. She had written that book, and she'd been a medical technical writer before. This was her first. So in fact, she was very hopeful, because she had come almost from the same situation as me. She was a writer already, but she was writing a technical language and trying to, write fiction. In a way, memoir writing is you need those skills of fiction writing. You can tell the truth and still write in a style that's engrossing and takes you in, and expresses emotion. It's not cold. And so what I wanted to write first, instead of continuing that other book that Molly said, no, you should focus on something. It's too abstract. It was, it was very abstract. And put some people in it. So I decided to do it on Nicaragua, It turned out to be my Blood on the Border, my 3rd memoir eventually. But what happened is I was, in the process of writing, I kept coming back to, it kind of broke through something in my deeper self, where you go for, really for creative writing or any kind of artistic endeavor. What was coming out is memories of Oklahoma, of my past and my family. Because a lot of things in Nicaragua, strangely, out there in the zone I was in, it was the Mosquito Indian zone. It was so much like Oklahoma. There was red dirt. They had red dirt. they had, in English, they had what I call Okie accents, because all these workers had come down, a lot of them from Oklahoma, but from Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, to work for Standard Fruit Company that kind of controlled, before the Revolution, controlled that whole area. And they loved country and Western music, and they were all Protestant. There were a few Catholics, but Protestant had been converted by the Protestants. So there's all this church music from my childhood in the Mosquito Indian language coming out of the churches. And so I just kept, memories just kept coming out. I couldn't keep them down like I had before, you know. And so I just kept writing those, you know, and weaving that in. It actually makes the book, The Blood on the Border, very effective because I weave in these memories. But then it just started taking me over. And what Molly said, you know, when something begins to take you over, you should go with it, because it's a rare gift, you know, just go with it. And you can do that later. Mm-hmm. So that's why I ended up writing Red Dirt first.
Interesting.
It came out of the experience in Nicaragua, you know, that I thought, I'm loving these people. I go to their church. They're, you know, they listen to country western music, which I had pretty much rejected by that time. The music of my childhood, the church music, and yeah, I'm so comfortable here. If I can deal with it, why can't I deal with my own people? You know, it's like perverse.
Yeah, what an interesting place to have a revelation. Yeah,
I know,
right?
yeah, it was just totally unexpected result of
Well, I'm glad
that
you did.
experience. Yeah.
I think, well, going back to your audience for those books versus your audience for that more academic books, do you feel like that you reached the audience, the people who didn't even know where Nicaragua was?
Yeah, immediately, you know, the publisher of that book, which was actually based in the United Kingdom in London, Verso Books, but they also have a United States publishing in New York. They said, well, we'll arrange your book tour now. I said, what's that? You know, because it's academic books, you know, come on, book tour, you know. Usually more and more people do now, but I had never heard of anyone doing that. You know, I had never done a reading of my work. I'd done lectures, but I'd never read from a book. And I honestly didn't know what they were talking about. And I didn't go to read. You know, I did go to some readings, but it was always it seemed like it was I knew performance poetry. Poetry is best if you hear it orally, and I love poetry. But I thought, this is strange, you know. I don't know what they're talking about. So they set up all these things for me, you know. And they said, well, what, you just go and choose a chapter to read, and then people ask questions, and just, you know, if they like it, they'll buy your book. And I said, oh, I hadn't thought about that, because I never tried to sell my book. So that was, you know, I came to Oklahoma. I did several readings in the Bay Area. The book came out in May, and I came here in, I guess it was August. Yeah, August.
And you're talking about Red Dirt right now, or the Blood on the
It was
Border?
for Red Dirt, 1997. So I came in August as my father's 90th birthday, and I had readings at different, I can't remember, the Borders, Barnes and Noble, you know, in Tulsa. I think my first reading was in a Tulsa Barnes and Noble. And all these people came, and all these young people came. And I was just so surprised, you know. And then I had readings in several different Barnes and Noble and Borders in Norman and Oklahoma City, and people came. And they invited me out to Piedmont, you know. The book got reviewed in the Daily Oklahoman, a positive review. And so in Piedmont, they said, well, you've got to come out here. So, you know, the whole... it's turned into a kind of suburb of Oklahoma City, but most people are derived from the country, you know, their families. And just packed this little city center they have now. And now they have a library. I went back when a new edition was published in 2005 by University of Oklahoma Press. So I did another round of readings in Oklahoma. But in 97, I was mystified. And it got nominated for the Oklahoma Book Award, and I never even knew it until several years later, because it was in the top. I don't know why I was never notified, but I found out from later the woman who managed it at the time. I said, Red Dirt has come out in a new edition. I said, since it was never nominated initially, technically, can it be nominated now? She said it was nominated. It was in the. But I probably had been informed, but it was chosen to be one of the best 100 books by the LA Times, and my editor called up all excited. And I didn't know what 100. Well, it's a lot of books. I mean, is that really important? So I was so naive about all these things, but I realized that it was doing what I wanted. It was getting out to the libraries here chose it as in 2003 as one of the Oklahoma Reads series, and so it gets in all the libraries. It's up on the front. They encourage it. They have reading groups, and so many people have. I say there's a good percentage of the population in Oklahoma who read that book, and it's really gotten around. It always sells well. It sells very well at University of Oklahoma. So this is, a complete surprise. And then the question at the end was, it ends when I'm 20 years old, moving to California. So they said, what happened next? So I wrote the other one, and I wanted to go back to the Nicaraguan one, but then I thought, well, that's going to be an awfully big book, if I have to go back to, say, 1960. Up through the 80s, because there's so much there that maybe I should. And the 60s are such a particular time, and a lot of 60s memoirs were coming out, and none from the women who have been in the women's liberation movement. So I thought that's what I will do, and I'll do what became Blood on the Border after that, just make them sequential. And so I got to work on that. And by that time, I knew the ropes, and I knew how to. I was just lucky that the publisher, Verso, they got me a very good. They don't do in-house editing. They hire someone from the outside. They got me a very good editor to work with. Mm-hmm. And I got used to working with an editor. I had never really had that before. I had it with the publication of my dissertation. I actually had a really good editor then, but it was an academic book. It was a very different experience. This was a lot of rewriting and reconceptualizing and show, don't tell, long passages of telling this and telling that. Say, find a situation where it tells that story, tell stories that contain the information you want to get over, rather than just tell this happened. So it felt really, trained as a historian, it felt very uncomfortable at first to even use the I voice. But I did decide it's a way, initially writing Red Dirt, it's a way of telling history, because I told the history of socialist Oklahoma through telling my grandfather's experience through my father's stories. So I told them as my father's stories. And I think this is why it, even if people don't agree with the politics, they learn about the state's history. And for a lot of young people, it has led them to really stay here, for one thing, and most people who don't have, I think I was kind of peculiar, because even the Oklahomans who went out, the Dust Bowl Okies, they're in, fourth generation now. They still have a nostalgia and love for it. There's something, I said there is really something special about Oklahoma. It's a very special place. It was Indian territories. It's like a microcosm of the whole country, all compressed into 3 million people here. And I started really having a respect, which is a kind of self-respect for that being the source of who I was, So, and I think a lot of people have that, and, they are very attached. They don't want to leave Oklahoma, but sometimes you feel forced out, if you can't, like gay people. I have a gay nephew and a lesbian niece, and they have not felt comfortable. They come back all the time. They love it here. They would love to live here, but especially my gay nephew, who's also performs as a queen, and was doing that in San Francisco. You got beat up in the parking lot so many times, leaving the club.
Here in Oklahoma?
Yeah. Just, 2 or 3 punks, who they go around beating up gays. And so it was dangerous, and you had to watch your back all the time. So there's still a lot of problems like that drive people away. So San Francisco, there are all these, when I do red dirt readings, all these Okie exiles show up, these young people, and they would really like to come back, So I encourage them to, because I can put them in contact now with people they can hook up with and not be so isolated. It's harder for gays, I think, than even that has changed somewhat, but I don't know. It's still pretty darn hard, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with you that the climate has definitely changed, even in the last 10 years, but I can see that there's still...
And the centennial, of course, there was some odious revivals of the land rush, but the presence of the native people really organized and challenging it and educating young people. I think it turned out that it was I think if it were being organizing the 120th or 25th now, they'd do it very differently than they did at that time.
You would hope so.
Yeah.
You would hope to take from that lesson. So, do your audiences for your book readings look different when you read for something like Red Dirt or Outlaw Woman versus a book like Indigenous Peoples' History? Or
Well, yeah, I suppose, although you get a fan, and I'm the same way. If I like an author's work, they do very different things. I like some things better than others, but I will go hear them because I just like them. So I have some fans who in different places. I don't always know them, but they come and they've either been in a reading group that's read something of mine and they want to read other things. So that's a kind of base, so it doesn't really matter what the book is. And that's why I think this book, which is a little heavier, and has footnotes and index and things that can alienate people, I think the response has been better because, most people have gotten to know my work first through the memoirs. So they feel familiar with me, they feel like they know me. And then there are new people, of course, that have just, especially young Native Americans who they knew my work, my research work, but they hadn't read my memoirs. So they come with a different perspective. But I get all kinds of groups, that I think you might not find that much diversity at a regular, an author reading. It's, they can usually be kind of characterized as an all-white audience, an all-black audience, or all Latino, or all Native American, or most, Mine is, really diverse, always. Sometimes with a predominance, like I've had a lot of sponsorship from Native American Studies centers, and so they really bring out the, Native community. that's really nice in Portland. That was the case in Portland State University. It was just so nice to have a huge audience. I mean, that was one of the largest gatherings I've spoken to, and in the new Native American Center, which is this beautiful, native, like Northwest Coast style, and a big space, and lots of wood and just gorgeous space. And so many people from the community, they said, never come on that campus, came. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the Native community was there in force, and the immigrant community, and it was just, they were amazed, and it put the Native Center kind of in touch with a lot of other groups. The Oregon Jericho, which is a prison advocate, prisoner advocate group, they got co-sponsors, which was really good. They got a bunch of co-sponsors, and they all came. Yeah. So, yeah, that's very exciting, the audiences. I thought yesterday in the library was very diverse, because I had only done readings of my memoirs before.
Here in
the library.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and when I did the new edition of Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, 2007, I did at the public library. It was almost all faculty members from the university.
Really?
As being an academic book.
Yeah, isn't that is interesting. And even yesterday, you had a lot of people that wanted to linger and talk to you and ask.
Yeah.
And it's I wonder that too, as I've been sort of researching for your visit and looking at the different things that you've read and talking to other people who admire your work or have read your work, whether they're faculty, whether coming from the academic side or coming from the personal interest side. I was kind of curious what the makeup would be too. And I wonder, you talked about this a little bit yesterday, this relationship you have with other academic, either historians or mainly historians, that chronicle the same field that you do, either Native American history or, as you sort of made the point, many Native American historians are not staying in the history field, they're migrating to other places that are more welcoming to different perspectives. I wondered if you might talk a little bit about your relationship, your decision to stay in the history field, and also a little bit about your decision to, and you talked about this too, your decision to come at this story of Indigenous history in the United States from a very specific viewpoint. And how I think that the public audience, I think that you were surprised. You mentioned yesterday you were surprised by the turnout and the fact that your book has sold out 6 times since it was out in the last 9 months, 7 months, which I think is amazing. But is the academic history field, the people buying that book too? I wonder.
It's interesting. I am sort of like Angie DeBow in this respect. I've never had a job in the history department. I entered academia in directing a Native American Studies program. My appointment was because there was no Native American faculty set-asides. It was they asked me what field you want in anthropology. I said, goodness, no, I didn't know first thing about anthropology. I'm a historian. So the history department reluctantly, and then they were the ones who had to review me and everything, and I didn't have to teach any of their courses, and I volunteered to teach a U.S. survey course, so they were glad. They always have, problems getting enough people because it's a required course. But I did that for, 74, 75, 76, 77, and then I went to New Mexico for 3 years, University of New Mexico, on leave from my university. And I came back and Howard Zinn's book had come out in 1980. So I went back to teaching my U.S. history, and I adopted that book. You know, it was just I was having to kind of teach against the text, and before that, which I became quite expert at, you know, using a text I didn't agree with as teaching critical thinking in the process. Mm-hmm. But it was really nice to have, teach critical thinking, because I had some criticisms of his book, but basically it was a whole different framework. And the next semester they, first of all, they called me in and said, "You think you might choose a more substantial book than Howard's?" And they couldn't tell you. You have faculty freedom. But the next semester I got uninvited to, so I never taught that in the history department again. And then we got our own faculty positions when we developed an ethnic studies department. So I never have been. I'm really not in the history field, but I insist that I am still a historian, and I've been in the associations. I'm probably more active in American Studies Association, the National Women's Studies Association, Ethnohistory, Society of Ethnohistory, but I have, early on I insisted on doing panels and papers at the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, and the Western History Association. And one of my mentors, Vine Deloria, he insisted that all of us, that we be there, we insist on being there. And even some anthropology conferences. So I was doing conference papers all the time because we wanted to have the presence of, and there weren't very many of us. So there was an ethnic studies journal early on out of the University of Washington, and that was a peer review, so we could all publish there. I've never been published in any of those classic historians' journals. And they pretty much ignored the new book. But it's, it's like the discussion Billy, who's a graduate student here, and a native graduate student in history, discussed. It's just, in some ways it's an impenetrable field. You have some more liberal people, but, they are not that much more interested in, Native American they see as a subfield. So this doing a history of the United States from a perspective, but a lot of history graduate students show up and write me and buy the book. And I'm assuming when I get, say, 20 or so from around the country, people who go to the trouble to write me an email and thank me for the book, that must represent more who, like, I read a good book and I think, well, it's kind of imposing on that person to write to them and say, thank you for your book. But now I'm going to encourage people. It's nice, to thank you. I've done it more since then. That's very nice. With the memoirs, I expected it. I expected people who've had the same experience, but with this kind of book. And so I spoke at Notre Dame, and the history department actually sponsored it there. That was a breakthrough. That's a Catholic university, and conservative in some ways, but it's also somewhat more open than a lot of the public schools that have more community pressure on them, They kind of leave their academic, the hierarchical church kind of leaves except the religious studies, kind of leave it alone. And they have, I was just amazed there how open people were to, they're actually talking about developing Native American studies, and there's several faculty members in touch with the local, the people there are the Potawatomi, the vestige of the Potawatomi who were forcibly relocated. They're still there, so I got to meet with them. And they were very keen on, they have a casino on it. Said, what you should do is what the Chickasaws have done. and I told them about the Chickasaws setting up that Chickasaw Studies at Ada, and I didn't even know about this sovereignty program that they've just set up here at OSU.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to write them about that and say, go farther than that. Set up a sovereignty program. I have a copy of, the announcement of it.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to send that to them because it'll be very useful to me to say, here's an example of what you can do, here at your university where they have nothing.
Yeah. Well, and that's also, it seems like that's an important role, that by having this sort of popular following and being invited all these places to share, that you use that as an opportunity to make these
Exactly,
connections.
to build something there, like Columbia University, where they have one Native American faculty member in the whole, and she's a good one. She's Mohawk, and that is, they're from that area, and she's anthropology. She has Cornell anthropology PhD. But still, one person and no infrastructure. She's in the anthropology department, which is very supportive of her work. But something should be set up there. So I think that people who came to the seminar I did there, probably about 100 people, I don't know, 75 to 100. I'm very bad at counting people, but there were some key people who talked to me afterwards or wrote me afterwards, that they really want to move on, doing something more. Because I think I made the point yesterday that when I was losing, Native students because they became more in demand at my state university, and I redirected it toward a non-Indian audience, that they need to know this history because it's U.S. history. And any university that doesn't have that is deficit. I don't care how elite they are, they're deficit because they are not, they simply are not doing their job. So I've really, and it makes sense to people. It's not something that would cross their mind because they think Indians are the West. The people back east, they don't think they have to do anything because they don't have, people demonstrating or, demanding, and that's how they set up African American studies, and they're not even very good on Latino, or Mexican studies because they feel like and yet they're supposed to be world centers of intellectual centers, a representative of something, of all knowledge, and the best in at Princeton and Yale and Harvard. They think they're the best in history, and they don't even have Native American history. I mean, so I kind of shame them a lot, and I say, and they find it useful. Here's a book they can actually read and get that framework and see how it could be. Mm-hmm. And then it has a reference of suggested readings in the back of a curriculum they could actually establish immediately. It's not like they'd have to start from zero.
That was one of the things that I noticed while reading the book. I mean, your citations are massive. I mean, in a good way. I mean, but you, I think, seem to be very intentional to really make your citations strong, make your point from the archival side, like a good historian or would. Do you get pushback from that, even with the massive amount of citations, the suggested reading, and the sort of the primary source material that you bring in to back up the case that you're making? Do you still get pushback from the side of it not being accurate or being biased or being one-sided? Yes.
Well, that was even if I hadn't gone through the memoir writing process, I don't think I could have written this book because all that material I'd done in '86 on the military, I put in a completely, it's completely different language than it was in that book, because I broke through the prohibition on bringing yourself into the story or bringing your own knowledge or having a point of view. Mm-hmm. So historians hide under this fallacy, really, of not having a point of view, that they are objective observers. well, how is it that all the stuff they leave out, doesn't count? Yes, they're documenting what they do. They write a biography of Andrew Jackson. They use the documents. They never mention Indians or the removal. I'm sorry, that won the Pulitzer Prize, when that biography came out. And there's no mention of Native Americans in it. That is poor scholarship, So I think, they know that. And once the cat is out of the bag, they can't hide under that objectivity anymore. So it was very liberating, but very scary because I got back into my academic historian mode to write this book, and I kept trying to, I had all the time having this conversation with myself that, because it's just almost creates a writing block, the idea of writing a book. I mean, when it finally dawned on me that book is supposed to be putting out there exactly what I think, and I don't have to put every historian in there and argue with them, because that's very boring to ordinary people, probably even to other scholars. I mean, it might be juicier, but for other historians, but we don't care. We just, well, what do you think? What do you keep talking about these other historians if you disagree with them? And it was so liberating once I said I'm going to write a whole draft that is just exactly what I think, and that then I'd written many drafts. This then became what I then worked on with the editor and everything. Went through a lot of processes. It was about 5 times too long when I first finished. But I could really go, once I broke through that. But that took about 5 years of, squirming and writhing and cursing Howard Zinn and and being compressed, wanting to get out of it, because it was very hard to get that the historian in me off my shoulder, that you do not, without, I document, but I'm also interpreting documents, and they do too. But they think because they're quoting them exactly like they are, that it's objective. But they're quoting some genocidal general, It's like, is this really a valid source? What did the other side think? Well, the Native Americans aren't there. They're the object of the killing machine, and they have something to say about it. So I create as they do, in their own history of settler societies, they create scenarios where they can't document it. And especially with social history, they interpret what people might have thought, done, why they did this and why they did that. They're always speculating on these things. So I think making them aware that this is it is an indigenous people's history of the United States. So I don't know. I'm more hopeful than I was when I finished it. Bottom line to me was to be able to give this as a gift to young Native American prospective scholars as a set of arguments that they could, because they know all this stuff, but it was really hard to put it all together into, a set of arguments that that are usable. Say, plagiarize me, just, you have to say my name, just put it in different words, say the same thing, but to conceptualize. And that was really hard for me to bring all that together, because it was all here and there, but to, consolidate it into a concise volume. So, yeah, I'm happy with it. As I do readings, I see things I'd like to, one day I want to do a revised edition. This paperback that will come out, they're only allowing me to, correct a few typos that weren't caught and everything. And I said, I want to change that. And there were a few errors in the book. Yeah, it depends on what edition you got, because they corrected as we went along, and then I would find more, because every time I read a chapter, I say, oh no, that was supposed to be like expansive, and it's extensive in the. It doesn't make it nonsensical, but it's a little weird, you know. I say extensive. It's not the right. I mean, it's a word, but it's not the right word. So it's a typo. You know, a T and a P. So.
That's actually really valuable, and that helps answer a question from earlier about sort of who your audience for various things are. So last night at the book talk, you also revealed that you have this sort of debate showdown planned. I call it a showdown. I don't know what you would call it. At the Organization of American Historians. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, the Organization of American Historians has it has gotten more open. Vine Deloria's son, Phil Deloria, who's very prestigious, has published some really wonderful books. He's at University of Michigan. He has consistently, you know, followed his father's practice of being there. He's had a hard time persuading others to be in that alienating situation, and, you know, my colleague Jennifer DiNatale is really fed up with the history field. She's just really given up on it. But I did persuade her to come to St. Louis to the Organization of American Historians. We're doing a panel called Ethnocide or Genocide, Native Americans and the United States. I designed this panel, and it was I was planning to do a panel, I wouldn't have called it that. I would have just called it an Indigenous People's Perspective on U.S. History and formed a panel. That was my plan, and I kind of regret I just felt like we had to address this book by a major historian of Native Americans, Gary Clayton Anderson at University of Oklahoma, senior professor, who teaches the only Native American history courses that are taught at University of Oklahoma, including seminars, you know, to get a doctorate in history. You have to pick from him, and you know, I've had discussions and disagreements with him, but he's written on subjects like the Texas Rangers, that book that kind of, you know, really, it was nominated for the Pulitzer or National Book Award, I'm not sure, one of the prestigious nonfiction awards, and it was a finalist. It didn't win in the end, but it was University of Oklahoma. But it really should have. It was a very thorough, you know, unvarnished story of the storied Texas Rangers that is almost all romanticized, like the Canadian Mounties, and it's just a bunch of Indian killers, both of them, you know. And so he's very good. He didn't give, the Comanches much of a voice in it, but they were the victims, and the Mexicans were victims, but it's still good, usable history with, I couldn't have any complaints about it. And his previous work, he did a small biography of Sitting Bull that was okay. It was okay. It was well documented. He did some document work on the Dakotas in Minnesota that were very useful. So this new book, it has really long, complicated title. The whole story on the front of the book, which seems to be the trend these days, but it's something like Native Americans and the United States, ethnic cleansing but not genocide. So that it's a thesis book. To me, it's not that different from my book in being a point of view book, but he will say it's objective, I'm sure, that it's, that he's fully documented, that and proved that ethnic cleansing was, not only it was not only a war crime. He says that war crimes were committed, with ethnic cleansing, but in the end that it was beneficial. And so this is a big surprise to me. I found the book very, very hard to read and argue with. So how I've set it up is, it's not set up as, you don't really set up debates as such, but it's kind of like that, where I present my argument that it was genocide, and I assume he'll present his ethnic cleansing argument. So I just thought, it's important that the kind of students that read his work are interested in Native American studies, as a lot of white students are now, even African American students, a lot of Latino students, very interested in Native American history, that they have some context for reading his book and making their own judgment. Because he does have a lot of documentation. It's always like, what's left out there? He doesn't really ever present the genocide, the official United Nations Convention on the Crime of Genocide, the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. That's the full title of that covenant. And it has 5 specific things that can be genocidal policies. It doesn't have to be genocide committed that you identify. So it's very useful historically. That word was invented in that treaty. So if you're going to use that, use it and dismiss it, you got to deal with what it says, and he doesn't. And so he gets different so-called experts on genocide to reinforce him and say. He actually tells in the book how he organized a public symposium on genocide. I didn't even know about this, where he invited these experts in, and of course they were all experts who were saying no, that because what they didn't know anything about Native Americans, but what he presented to them as, I said, no, that doesn't fall under genocide. So he documents his book with experts who know nothing about Native American or U.S. history, except what he presents to them. And so it's, I think it's, I'm not going to refer to his, I'm going to refer to ethnic cleansing because it's a term that only got created during the Balkan Wars, and it has no, the phrasing has no content in international law. If ethnic cleansing if you're going to bring charges, you don't bring charges of ethnic cleansing, you bring charges of genocide. And that's what they're being charged with. The Balkan defendants is not ethnic cleansing, but genocide. So he's choosing a word that is practically means the same thing, but has no force in law. But he thinks he kind of makes up what it means. That like he's basically dealing with removal, and he doesn't really deal with the boarding schools, which could in themselves, 100 years of federal boarding school experience is being very well documented now with the boarding school studies and testimony over the last 10 years. It's going to be an important work when someone puts that all together and presents it, because it's massive documentation of interviews that were done in the past. I had access to some, I use a couple of testimonies from from 1920s of people who were in boarding schools. I doubt that he even looked at that. I've got to study it more carefully. I read it last year when it came out, and when I just, I didn't take notes or anything, so I still have to prepare. But basically, I kind of wanted to not be too stuck on his argument, so I can just present a very clear paper, a 20-minute paper. And then in the discussion, I'm sure I won't change his mind, but I just thought and to his credit, he knows exactly what I think, and he agreed to be on the panel. And he's he's a very capable person and a strong arguer for his, and he's the kind of person the kind of historian that, can kind of cite without looking at a piece of paper, the exact document and where it's stored and whether it's handwritten, it's like the date of it. And, I'm not that kind of historian. I rely on I'll look that up. I know where to find it. I mean, most things I have down, but he uses that. People can use that as a tool to make it seem like, the massive documents and that you can rattle off in your head, then it kind of overwhelms. So what they're saying, interpretation must be true.
Right. Well, I wish you all luck. I hope you get an audience of eager young people interested.
It may be interesting. Maybe no one will come,
I
I want to avoid this subject.
I think that there'll be some water fountain drama
I
going
just hope
on outside
Jennifer
the room.
doesn't go rogue. Say entirely what she thinks about his story.
To be continued. Well, so this leads me a little bit into the same, into a follow-up from yesterday, in the fact that what I hear you saying is that you do take a lot of your time and a lot of your focus through your academic as well as your memoir to help encourage people to build their own work or look at their own sort of motivation and take arguments where they find the facts and not be afraid to use that to gain this larger voice.
Right.
So one of the things that I heard you say yesterday a couple of times was the first was when you sort of got interested in activism in general, you thought you needed to wait for an invitation, right?
Right.
You had this idea that you had to be invited to the table.
Right.
And then later on you realized you just need to show up.
Right.
But on the other hand, there were several points where you participated in key things, and it was by this invitation. For example, when you were sort of recruited as a expert witness at Wounded Knee,
Right.
in the trial of Wounded Knee, it's because someone came to you and...
Yeah, I don't think I would ever have, it wouldn't have occurred to me to go offer myself, because I didn't, I didn't know about the my specialization was elsewhere.
Right.
And I was very good at that. I didn't really have to. I was so integrated with the other people doing that work in New Mexico that I would hear something's happening and I would just go, if I really felt I had something to offer. But in this, I said, well, I can't do that. I don't know anything about, the treaties, and I did Latin American history. And
So what did they use your expert testimony for? What did you end up doing?
Well, they first of all, I learned, in an interesting way, not as an academic, but from the people, themselves. They know everything about their treaties. People who haven't even gone to school. They know. Billy there yesterday, he's from Cheyenne River Sioux.
That was at the book talk last night.
He could, I'm sure, when he was 5 years old. They teach their children all about the treaties. So and other tribes do too, but probably the Sioux is the most strongly. And as they win, it affects all other Native people with treaties in a good way too. Or if they lose, it affects them, in other ways. But they're very focused on it, and it just seemed like a whole new field. But what I found is a lot of what I had developed and, theoretically was very useful to them as we talked. And they said, the whole colonial framework that I had developed for my New Mexico studies, studying colonialism, and this was something they had before, all legal, it was almost all legalistic, all lawyers, and what you do is just kind of get in a spin, because Indian law is a kind of a, it's kind of a trap in its way, because it's colonial law. It's all made by the United States, and Native people would get the best they could out of it and eke out what they could, and they won. In fighting, the U.S. would sue for peace and then negotiate, and they couldn't get much, but until they were forcibly disarmed, if the treaty was broken, like the '68 treaty when Custer and his 7th Cavalry took the Black Hills and the U.S. just annexed it. Well, Crazy Horse and a whole new resistance, and then they just slaughtered all the buffalo and slaughtered all the Indians and penned them up in concentration camps. These weren't just reservations, and they couldn't go out without a pass. They had nothing. Until that point, they and they still couldn't erase the 1868 treaty. They had already themselves, the U.S. government, ended treaty making with Indians, so they couldn't force them into a new treaty. So it stands so they made it stand. And this was a whole new different story of resistance. I looked at the Pueblo resistance and Navajo resistance, but it was a completely different story of resistance. But it was easy to learn because Vine Deloria had done so much research and writing and his own, just oral history. So I just studied and studied, but they also I also got involved with the defense, so I was part of the team as well as an expert witness. They really were happy to have a historian. It's the first time they had a historian involved, because they were all legalistic. And because I'd also had a year of law school, they could also communicate with me about the law. I couldn't help them much there because I wasn't beyond property law. But I knew how law worked and its limitations and what you could do within it, as most trained as historians wouldn't know, because I had a year of law school at that point. So they did. I was about 7 hours on the witness stand. They brought me in at different times most of it was traditional people testifying, traditional Lakota, but also some Philip Deere Creek from Oklahoma, someone from Cheyenne, Southern Cheyenne, gave their own cases of the United States. It wasn't just the Sioux. And they had me talk about the Pueblo lands claims and the land being taken away. And that very year, there was a return of some sacred territory to the Sioux, to the Taos Pueblo, that I gave as an example. So that knowledge was helpful as supplementary to their arguments, for the Sioux Treaty. And so they questioned me about that, and at the same time, in the 2 weeks there, I'd been reading and learning from Vine Deloria and all the materials I was given, but there, that 2 weeks, I absorbed so much just listening to the testimony of all these people. It was like reading. You couldn't get that in reading 1,000 books or documents. And so I ended up publishing, the testimony as the Great Sioux Nation oral history of the Sioux people and their treaty. And it's so rich, people really love that. I love that book. And you would think nothing could be more boring than court testimony. But when it's Lakotas talking about their treaty, it's extremely interesting.
Well, wasn't that that published piece, wasn't that the basis of the 1977 United Nations?
It was the primary document that the International Indian Treaty Council, they wanted me to have it come out in time, and it was hard to get it, 74 to 77. I had to work with 5,000 pages of court transcripts and get it down to a sizable, I wanted it to be documentation, but also, there are a couple of essays in it, and my introduction, and some things about the International Indian Treaty Council. But I found, finally, I just cut out everything that the lawyers or judges said and just made it the oral history peppered with these expert witness, which I didn't mind editing. I never did edit out a word of the Lakota testimony. But for us expert witnesses, I could shorten it. Then I had to get approval, of everyone to publish it. It was quite a process. So it was taken and deposited at the UN as the primary document that got us started on the international.
Yeah, which is, I think I was missing that key point of the connection between the two events, but that's pretty incredible. So remind me, were you involved with AIM before you were this expert witness?
Yes. In 1974, I joined the American Indian Movement Council of San Jose. And then we consolidated it with San Francisco, and I moved up to San Francisco, and I was on the AIM Council, the Bay Area. So I was involved with AIM, and then the Treaty Council was founded in 1974, and it was, primarily at first treaty nations, Indian nations, but others got involved too, but it was mainly the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Shoshones, and Paiute. All in the West, they made treaties with almost all the people, the Kickapoo, the Haudenosaunee. They had their Jay Treaty, which was a treaty between Britain and the United States. So, but they had a role in it because they were belligerents on the side of the British, and they had gotten some, a confirmation of their sovereignty and their right to cross the border without having any checks on them, and that's been hard to maintain with this security state thing. But they've had several uprisings where they occupy the border, the Mohawks, and they have kept it open, to them. They're very resistant people. So they got involved from the beginning of the Treaty Council. They hadn't been involved at the Sioux Treaty hearing, but once the Treaty Council started preparing for this 77 conference, they got involved. And lots of Canadian groups. There was AIM in Canada, but there were also different organizations there. And then, with Latin America, they were organizing separately. This, was very hard to get up here, although we had quite a few Mapuches from Chile because of the coup in 1973. A lot of Mapuches had to, because they had been, they're very activists always, historically. They're kind of like the Sioux, maintaining their land base. And they were really targeted by the coup. It's a lesser-known story that, they had about 10% of their population slaughtered after that coup. So they said a lot of the young people who were known as the rabble-rousers, the organizers, got them out of the country. And some of them were in the United States and a lot of them in Europe. So the work we were doing in Geneva was really helpful to have those Mapuches. There was a coup in Bolivia in 1980. So by then there were a lot of Aymara and Quechua in exile, political exile. So in Europe. So it was really, it was a good base because it's harder to get into the United States and work at UN headquarters than Geneva.
Oh, interesting. It is interesting how, your transition to get from that point until, it's very high profile. And sort of this top level of advocacy, as well as people showing a respect for your knowledge, right? So I wonder, you started out being interested in this from a colonial point of view because you were studying colonization in Mexico.
Right.
And then that sort of broadened, right?
Oh, this also
across
applies
the border, right?
beyond New Mexico.
Yeah. So, were you the person that sort of came to the American Indian movement and said, "I'm interested in, using my knowledge and my research and my sort of advocacy focus towards your effords," or did they come to you and say, "You're doing all this work, we want you with us"?
Yeah, I think joining AIM, living there in San Jose, and while I was doing my dissertation and going to law school, I just made friends. My neighbor was a Navajo woman in the apartment building I lived in. There was one other Native American law student I got to know. And then one of the main lawyers for the Wounded Knee Legal Defense, who was doing it pro bono, was a pretty high-profile white lawyer named John Thorne, who had been Angela Davis's lawyer, for instance, on her team, criminal law. And he had gotten involved. They had called him in, and all these big lawyers of the time volunteered their work. Being in law school, they kind of came there finding people, so they identified me as someone to work with, and just through all those connections, I started going to the Indian Center a lot, going to powwows, and because I get invited, and it was more organic, I guess, than say when I was formally recruited to do the. It was kind of separate because the AIM was still active and the Treaty Council was just formed in '74. I would say that there were different sources of this colonial framework, that we were parallel but didn't know each other at first. And one was Jack Forbes, who I met in '74. He already had developed, and all I knew of his work was a book from 1960 from the University of Oklahoma, which is bedrock of my thesis, called Apache, Navajo, and Spaniard. And it was all about colonialism. And I didn't even know he was still alive. I thought, and then when I moved back to San Francisco, they said, "Oh, he's at UC Davis." I said, "Oh my God, so I've got to beat this guy." So we started writing each other, and met pretty quickly. And he was an activist. He had set up this DQ University. Was active at Alcatraz, and he had a PhD in history, and set up the first Native American program, I think, in the country at UC Davis, where he was already teaching. And he also was, he had published a lot of different things, but it was sort of different kinds of studies about urban Indians and, he was a real activist historian, which was unusual, and he was actually in the psychology department. He wasn't hired in history either. Yeah, he was in the psychology department, so they were the ones supportive of the Native American history starting. That ended up he also, before he passed away, set up a PhD program in Native American history, Native American studies, and he had extended it to hemispheric studies, so it's very prestigious. UC Berkeley came soon after with a PhD. Those are the only PhDs in Native American studies. So he was building, so we had a lot in common, building ethnic studies, Native American studies, being historians, but he also had this colonial framework. And we diverged on some things, interpretations, but then there was another, and he hired this Métis scholar from Saskatchewan, who had been at University of Saskatchewan, but also the president of the Métis Association of Saskatchewan, and a real activist, fiery activist, Howard Adams. And so he was there then at Davis, and so they were they were both older than me. I think Howard had gotten his PhD in 1962 and Jack in 1960. And so they were, just a decade older than me, but they certainly, I considered them mentors because this is what they had done from the very beginning, and they were also activists. And Howard had a whole, because of the decolonization movement worldwide, he, unlike Jack, who had kind of made it up on his own, Howard just had this vast knowledge base of decolonization literature from around the world. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there was this activist group in Vancouver that called themselves the Native Marxist Study Group, who were not academics but activists, who we got linked with, our AIM chapter got linked with. And they were also studying decolonization around the Portuguese colonies, the British colony. So it was, and then I looked back, this new book that came out on Native American civil rights in the 1950s, that Darcy McNichols and some of these earlier scholars, they were also doing that, and it kind of got lost to us, that literature. It's a really important book that, was all documented, but there was such a generational gap between what they were doing and the kind of Cold War that put a, chill on everything, and then AIM, the kind of movement that came out when these people were, most of them had, not all, but some of them had passed away, like Darcy McNichol. Never got to meet him. We were, started reading their work too, and seeing that this was always, and then for the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of the Iroquois, they go back to the 1920s with their colonial framework, when they tried to join the League of Nations as a, that was Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric of decolonization then, but that meant, kind of those empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe, independence for those Slavic states and all.
So they tried to join it as a sovereign nation?
Yeah.
Is that what,
Yeah, and Descaya, the person they sent, the envoy they sent, Chief Descaya, he stayed there for 12 years. Never was allowed in. I think he was invited into one meeting, but he became a fixture, dressed in his traditional, very traditional attire as the position he held. And they're very formalistic, the Haudenosaunee and their diplomatic relations. But he became a part of the lore of Geneva, which is just incredible that every school child and every adult has grown up there since the 1920s. They learn in Geneva history, which they study, because Geneva is a city-state, it's not just Switzerland, it's Geneva. Descaya is one of the most important figures in their history. He stayed in different people's homes. They took him in.
Wow.
He actually had no money, they got up enough money to send him there. So there are all these stories. So when we went in 1977, everyone, they all knew that history, the Haudenosaunee, but other Native people didn't. And we were received like dignitaries because of the Haudenosaunee delegation, and the president of the Geneva Canton, and of the city of Geneva, and all the town's fathers and the bigwigs of the city received us in this formal reception. It is amazing, and the Geneva people don't like the UN. They hardly will go near it, and they do not like all the staff that live there. They kind of push them out in these suburbs to live, in this housing. And because they're so unfriendly to the foreigners, they don't like they say they don't like the Swiss. And here we are, we have all these friends in town, and it's baffling to people at the UN. Well, no one can make friends with those people. They're so grouchy, we have this special in, So it was that's why it was so effective, is that I think even without that connection, that probably we would have, because it's just the Indian way of not just being someplace without knowing the people there, they would have found a way to get to know and win the hearts and minds of the local people. But it was a very funny situation. So the UN was very happy about it because they're scared to death that Geneva's going to kick them out sometime because they dislike them so much. These international people there, and so have Swiss come into the UN. The only thing that kind of holds it there is the International Red Cross. When those they call it Geneva Conventions, were made in 1948, the Geneva authorities insisted that it be based in Geneva and have a Geneva head, a Swiss head. That got, expanded to beyond Geneva, a Swiss head at all times, directorship. So that was written into the. So there are 4 Geneva Conventions, and this International Red Cross, that is really a non-governmental organization with status in the UN, is in charge of all law that has to do with war and refugees. So we had an immediate in to the ICRC because of the Swiss connections. Those are the elite Swiss families who run it.
So how did they find you, or did you find them?
Well, at this reception, we met them all. Initially, like the first day in Geneva, we met them all right there. Because they are all the Swiss who are running the International Committee on the Red Cross, they too grew up with this guy, So the employees could be from all over the place, and they brought people from everywhere. But that was very useful to us because the wars in Central America started being, wars against the native people of Guatemala in particular, but also the Nahua people in El Salvador, and then the Mosquito Indians being recruited to the Contras. So that there were refugee camps all over Central America. It was one of the main refugee projects in the 1980s, and this became a very important connection that I kind of nourished because I had studied the Geneva Conventions and been interested in them. I went and got a diploma in International Human Rights and Comparative Law at Strasbourg, University of Strasbourg, a special program they have in English, French, and they were adding Spanish, but I could take the whole program in English, and the best experts in this, and I learned the Geneva Conventions, and so that became very useful, having those ties at the top of the and then that hooked us up automatically with the United Nations Committee on Refugees, humanitarian law. So that's the center of all Geneva's the center of all refugees. The World Health Organization. We started, making our inroads into it, and they would come to us. The International Labor Organization came and wanted to be involved. The World Health Organization are doing studies of traditional medicine and really hooked up, with some of our traditional people. So the meetings we would have there, it was just, they would then start coming to us, UNESCO, and the Food and Agricultural Organization based in Rome, So that I mean, it's just a whole new world, you know, for Indigenous peoples to have access to all these resources. And, you know, I was teaching at the time at University of New Mexico, and I could just give a call to some of these experts who were based in New York, and they would come out, say, on a weekend on their own dime, or they could work it out as a, you know, within their budget, and teach a seminar I would set up for the development planners, the tribal planners. So we had some of the world's greatest experts, the development economists, and who were doing work in Africa and other places to, you know, come for nothing and speak. So it gave us all kinds of resources. That it opened up at just the time when there was this tremendous repression that almost destroyed. I think it kind of did. AIM still exists by name, and, you know, it's kind of, but the Treaty Council really carried on the work of AIM, because AIM, there was this counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO of the FBI that we only learned about, you know, in the late 70s with the church hearings after the Nixon resignation. They were doing all of this counterinsurgency that is okay to do in foreign countries, but was against the law to do to your own citizen. And that all got erased, all the reforms with 9/11, you know, the Homeland Security, new legislation that just went back to the way it was before, so they can do anything they want now. But this was all scandal at the time, and so all these things happening, you know, the killing of, you know, Native leaders, incarceration on, you know, for felonies, for, you know, the slightest thing, it would get trumped up, and of course the Black Panther Party was also wiped out, the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican. So they were targeting all these, the Students for a Democratic Society, even the women's liberation groups. They were after all of them to kill that whole movement of the 60s. And AIM, it was devastating. So we already had, you know, after Wounded Knee, just 300 defendants to try to deal with, but then they kept increasing because they kept framing people and imprisoning them, and the whole leadership of the American Indian movement. So and then they started attacking the chapters too. And our Bay Area chapter, we had so much community support. I don't think they bothered with us, so we became one of the stronger chapters. But the one in LA was definitely disrupted, and 2 of the leaders were put on trial for a really horrible torture murder case, and it was 12 years before they were finally exonerated by DNA. They were on well, they would have been executed, but the death penalty was not in play. You know, the federal death penalty, and at least the state of you know, almost all the states had abolished the death penalty, and it didn't come back till 1977. So all of those people arrested would probably be dead now if it weren't Leonard Peltier, who's still in prison on 2 consecutive charges of murder of 2 FBI agents. And those 2 in LA who were absolutely innocent. It destroyed both of them, though, and destroyed the whole American Indian chapter there. So it was, you know, they were attacking local leaders in more isolated places, like in the Mojave, that area down there in the Mojave Valley. They had a chapter that just got decimated by fake charges, and so we were so busy helping, you know, defend people that it was very hard to organize in the community.
Do you think that they were? Did you have these organizations have the attention of that group before the Wounded Knee, or was it really in response to?
Yeah, I think with Alcatraz, of course, that was also under Nixon, and then, you know, the Trail of Broken Treaties, especially, which was in it was during the election period in November 1972 when Nixon won re-election, and he had done all these kind of cosmetic things that after Alcatraz, there was so much pressure from the public supporting Indian rights that they actually got legislation through the Indian Self-Determination Act, and Nixon signed it. I think he also knew that they could probably override a veto because there was so much public pressure. It was Democratic Congress, and but he did sign it, and he was trying. He did implement affirmative action and these things, trying to, at the same time that COINTELPRO was decimating these movements, sort of made it look like that they were setting up infrastructure, and so they already, the Alcatraz and the Trail of Broken Treaties, where they walked across country from LA, San Francisco, Seattle, 3 trains, caravans, covering, a good swath of the country and almost all of Indian Territory, stopping along the way. It took about 2 months, and they arrived there at right before Election Day in November 1972, and entered had a protest at the Bureau of Indian Affairs building. They put up a banner that said Native American Embassy, and then they went inside, to just, make it was like a publicity thing. They were getting a lot of press and publicizing the Sioux Treaty, and all the staff, are like, they were all white at the time, all shrieking, at all these feathered Indians coming in and running out. They all went running out, and then the Nixon gave the order to lock the doors. They locked them in, the protesters, and called it an occupation. It was really strange because they had no intention of staying there. And so it backfired because at that time all of the records of the BIA were paperwork, files. So they had nothing else to do. They started going through the files and finding really damning documents, which they packed up in boxes. And when they left, they took them with them.
How were they able to leave?
Well, Nixon, it became such an embarrassment to him, right at election time, and diverting, attention to this, and getting so much publicity. It was on television, constantly. It was so much fun to watch. And so he had his John Ehrlichman go over and offer them all one-way plane tickets out and escort to the airport to leave. And they said, why not? And they took all the boxes with them. There wasn't really, they were hustling them out of town, and they didn't even bother to see that they had they said, we're reporting, they did all this damage and they wrecked. Well, basically they went through all the files and they left, scattered and things, but they saw it as, initially they just saw it as vandalism and didn't realize that they'd taken all these documents.
So what happened? What happened to the paperwork once it left the building?
Well, it ended up in files at the UN.